Up next, we are continuing our statewide theme. We have Melanie Prokurat from the CABW talking about some of her work with using bioassessment data to develop or apply to conservation.
Hi. Today I'm going to be talking about the areas of conservation emphasis project that is being developed at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So I'm going to talk about the goals and purpose of the project and then go through some examples showing the types of data visualization decisions that we've had to make as we were developing the project. So the purpose of the project was to bring together our best available conservation relevant spatial data. So we've kind of gotten a critical mass of data now for all of our species in the landscape. And there's more and more maps and GIS data sets being developed every day. And so we were looking for a way to bring this together in a way to make it easier for decision makers and land managers to view the data. The ACE project, which stands for Areas of Conservation Emphasis, brings together a lot of our data products that have been developed in-house at our department. So that includes the California Natural Diversity Database, which is a database of rare species occurrence information, and then the California Wildlife Habitat Relationships System, which includes species range and distribution information for all of our terrestrial vertebrates, and the Survey of California Vegetation, which is developing fine-scale vegetation maps across the landscape. And so bringing all this information together and trying to create a picture of the landscape. We've created a series of non-regulatory maps and a viewer tool, which I'll show you today. And so the main purpose is to provide a course-level view of information, of our best available information for conservation planning purposes. And so this includes, it's sort of a departure from a lot of what we've talked about today. It includes both terrestrial and aquatic data. It was actually initially focused largely on terrestrial data, and over the past year we've been working on adding more aquatic data to it. So this is a snapshot of our data model, and so we have organized our data sets into 5 main categories, and those are biodiversity, significant habitats, connectivity, climate resilience, and recreation. And so all of those categories have ACE data sets associated with them. And then also within the viewer, we have State Wildlife Action Plan, conservation target data, we have stressors, and land conservation status, so that the users can look at all of the information at one time. So today I'm mainly going to be talking about the biodiversity data and a little bit about significant habitats. So we have a lot of information on biodiversity that's been collected over the past decades. And now we have modeled range and distribution data for many of our species. And so we wanted to bring all of that together into one place and summarize it for conservation planning purposes. And there's a lot of different ways that we could summarize and display biodiversity data. And so we tried to find what would be the most useful ways to summarize it. And we came up with 3 data sets. One is native species richness, and so that is a summary of all of our common and rare species that might be found in a given location. And then we have rare species richness, which is limited to just listed and species of special concern. And we added that because a lot of the conservation planning efforts are specifically focused on conserving rare species. And then we also thought it was important to add irreplaceability, which is where we weighted our rare endemic species by their distribution size. And so that would highlight the areas that have very rare species that don't, if you lose their habitat, there might not be another equivalent area that you could conserve. So those were the types of information that we were trying to portray with the data that we put together. We also put together layers of climate vulnerable species richness and game species richness because those are important to specific programs in our department. So we have a lot of data, and the take-home message of this slide is just to show that we put it together in building blocks. We tried to make it transparent and easy for people to see how the data was put together. And so it sort of is a data pyramid. And so the base of the pyramid is all the individual data about species, and then we roll that up into interim data layers, and then we get aquatic biodiversity, terrestrial biodiversity, and then overarching biodiversity. So initially when we were working on this, we were focused on creating this data set, the overarching biodiversity data set, and that's what some of our users really want. They want like one map snapshot where are the high biodiversity areas that we want to focus on. But then we saw that a lot of our users, like the minute that they look at that, they want to drill down deeper and see like what's causing those values, and they want to look at all those other maps. And so we made all of those other maps available too in the viewer. And I'll show you that in just a second. So one of the first questions or things that we needed to decide was what was our unit of analysis going to be? How were we going to put all this data together? For the terrestrial data, we decided to use a hexagon grid. We thought about using HUC-12 watersheds for the terrestrial data initially, but because we wanted to create these biodiversity measures, we didn't want them to be confounded by species area relationships, and the watersheds are really variable in area. So we chose hexagons, and because they have a standard area and they don't follow land ownership patterns, so it's really clear that we're not identifying a certain person's property as being very important for conservation. Then we had to decide what size of hexagon to use, and so we didn't want our map to have false precision where we're saying that we know more about the landscape than we actually do. And so we did a number of different analyses using different sizes of hexagons, and the size that we came up with was 2.5 square miles or 1,600 acres, and that's about 1 mile on a side. And then, as I mentioned, over the past year, we've been adding aquatic data, and the aquatic data we have been adding as HUC-12 watersheds. So I'm kind of going to walk you through the process of how we put the data together. So this is what our viewer looks like. It's built on the same platform as our BIOS viewer, so those who are familiar with our BIOS viewer, this should look familiar. And so the first thing we did was we put together our total native species richness. And we chose to rank the data in 5 categories just for the purpose of visualization. It's easy to see the difference between 5 categories, but if you get a lot more categories on the map, it can be hard to see the difference between the colors on the map. It's also straightforward conceptually because you have sort of low, medium, and high, and 2 interim values. But if you get a lot more, a larger number of bins, it's a lot harder to sort of interpret what the different values mean. So we chose to go with something that's simple to understand because we're putting a lot of complex data together, and it's already sort of overwhelming for some people. So going back to our main goal to provide information for conservation planning, we thought that this map of total native richness is actually not that informative, because if you're doing planning in the desert, everything is sort of looking uniformly low biodiversity value, and everything up here on the north coast is looking pretty uniformly high biodiversity value. And so a planner that's working in one of those regions, it wouldn't provide them that much information. So we decided to overlay ecoregion sections and then scale the data by ecoregion. So all of the data that's in our viewer for biodiversity shows low to high by ecoregion. The aquatic data we put into the HUCs, and we have not scaled it by ecoregion. So you see sort of a similar pattern here of low values in the desert and high value on the coast, which makes sense for aquatic data. And we've tried out a couple of things to see if it makes sense to try to normalize it or scale it by a smaller region of California. But we haven't come up with a solution for that yet. And so now I'll walk you through an example of how you might look at the viewer, how a user might use it, and what data it provides. So this is San Antonio Creek watershed. This is southwest of Livermore in the Bay Area. And it has a really high aquatic biodiversity score. And so that's one piece of information you could get from the viewer. You could then look at the terrestrial biodiversity score within the watershed and see how the terrestrial values show up within the watershed. And then you could look at the combined aquatic and terrestrial values and see what they look like. You might want to dig in further and choose a hexagon and get all of the species counts within your hexagon. So here you get your native species count, your rare species, endemic species, and then all of the different ranks that we developed for the watershed, and for the hexagon. You can select another hexagon nearby and look at how the values compare and see what's the difference, what's driving the differences between those areas. And then you can also select a hexagon and get the species list. And so the species list tells you which species were counted for that hexagon, whether it was based on an observation or a model, and whether the species is rare, endemic, or climate vulnerable. So all of this information is available as individual data layers within our BIOS viewer. But the purpose of the ACE viewer is to bring it all together into one place where it's sort of like a one-click solution for people to use. Similarly, you can get all of the counts for the aquatic species, and you can also get the list of aquatic species within your HUC of interest. If you just want to get an overview of what the data looks like, you can also just look at all of the maps within the viewer. So this is aquatic native species richness, aquatic rare species richness, and aquatic irreplaceability. And these maps are works in progress, so we're currently working on updating this, and we are expecting to have a new set of maps available in early 2019, and particularly we're making a lot of modifications to the aquatic data that's in there. So significant habitats, I'm just going to touch on this really briefly and mention this because this is where we're planning to add bioassessment data. So we've been working with Pete, Bodie, and Rafi and Marcus to get some of the bioassessment data for California and figure out the best way to incorporate it into ACE. It's been a challenge to symbolize or to portray the significant habitats on a map in a meaningful way, partly because we have limited information about habitat quality across the entire landscape. So we're hoping that the bioassessment data is going to be able to help with that. But what you can do right now within the viewer is if you select a hexagon or a HUC, it will give you a list of the types of significant habitats which have been mapped within that HUC or hexagon. And then you can look into that further. So for example, in this hexagon, there's been oak woodland and riparian mapped. and then you can open up the riparian data set, and that will tell you exactly which maps have mapped riparian there. So it's sort of like an index of, a place-based index of the maps. And then you can overlay those because all of the maps are in the BIOS viewer and look at where that riparian is actually mapped in the watershed. So the intended uses that we have right now for ACE are just to identify the conservation elements present at a site, to be able to compare relative value between the sites, and to evaluate the relative position of conservation elements in the landscape. We haven't combined all of the data into a single map. That's what a lot of people ask for, is the map. But we haven't done that because really it depends on what your question is. And we're working on developing use case scenarios for different types of conservation questions. And we're really interested in getting feedback from all of you and anyone who uses this on what would make it most useful. So all of the information that I went over today is on our website. There's a button to get to the ACE viewer, as well as a bunch of documentation. And there's also, for each data set, we put together a brief fact sheet. So also trying to get away from the 500-page report, we put together a fact sheet that's there between 2 and 6 pages in length with all of the information about each of the data sets. We are currently working on updates, as I mentioned. And the first question I usually get is, how do I submit my data? So if you have data that you think would be useful in ACE, you can submit your data set to BIOS, and there's information on our website about how to do that. Also, if you have rare species information, if you submit it to CNDDB using their online field survey form, it automatically gets rolled into ACE. Or you can contact us to talk to us more about it. So that's my contact information, or you can also contact Karen Miner, our branch chief, and there's the web address. Thank you.